So that's that. Everything else is the same. And on we go to one of my very favorite interview persons, Bob Hormats. You've all seen Bob before. If you're a FiRe person, you've been here before and seen him in person. And we're going to start out, before we get into the other deep, heavy stuff, we're going to start out with this. We have lots of copies here. The Price of Liberty. And this is just out. Bob's been on the hustings, the tour. I've heard you on NPR a couple of times, I think. And it's about this crazy notion that you should pay for what you do. Right, I guess it's pretty simple.
That's the
yeah. Okay. Would you like to give a longer description of?
I'll just take a couple of minutes. The book, The Price of Liberty. The title comes from Alexander Hamilton. After the American Revolution, the government, the Continental Congress, had accumulated a lot of debt. The states had accumulated debt. Some of that debt was to foreigners, and Hamilton concluded, with some degree of opposition from others, that we probably shouldn't pay that debt. Hamilton said we should definitely pay the debt because we need to establish the creditworthiness of the new country, and because critically important to the success of the U.S. during the Revolution was the ability to borrow from abroad, particularly from France and the Netherlands. If there were to be another war, which was widely anticipated at the time, the view was that we'd have to borrow again, and we would have to go to those same creditors to get the money, and therefore we needed to repay the first war debt in order to borrow again were there to be another war. And that tradition of borrowing during wars and paying down wartime debt very quickly afterwards really was a key element of American financial policy up until the 1960s. So that was really one point. You had to borrow during a war, but pay it down as quickly as you can. Fiscal responsibility, because it was seen not just as important for financial stability, but for national security as well. And the second point that comes through this book throughout is that war financing is not just about raising money, it's about engaging Americans in the war effort. When American troops are fighting abroad, Americans shouldn't be making sacrifices at home to support them. World War I, the Treasury Secretary, whose name was McAdoo, called it capitalizing patriotism. And during World War II, Roosevelt explains to Americans several days after Pearl Harbor that war costs money, that means taxes and bonds, bonds and taxes, it means sacrifices from all Americans. And I think that engagement of Americans behind their troops in the war effort has been very important in mobilizing support within the country for what's going on abroad, so that you don't have the soldiers fighting on one side and Americans going about their ordinary business and not paying taxes, not making any sacrifices back home. And the problem now, I think, in this war, even though this war is very small as a portion of GDP, just to put it in perspective, World War II annually cost nearly 40% of GDP, Korean War 15%, Vietnam 10%. This war costs less than 1%. So in a way, it's easy to sidestep the requirements of financing this war, and most of it's really been done by debt. But on the other hand, if you look down the road in the war on terrorism, which is going to continue for quite some time, it's not going to be so easy to pay for it, even though it's a small portion of GDP, because more is going to be crowded out by Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, which is going to account for a larger and larger portion of the budget. There'll be, as there was after Vietnam, a reaction among people saying, we don't want to fund national security at all. For 10 years after Vietnam, there was a huge plunge in support for national security spending. And that is going to cut back on a lot of the wartime spending that we're going to need for the war on terrorism, dealing with the 9/11 Commission report. A lot of those things weren't implemented. It's going to take 2 years to bring the military back to where it was in 2003. A lot of other unmet needs were not met because money was sucked into the Iraq War. A lot of it was not used very efficiently. And then the other element that brings you right back to Hamilton, to make this long story very short, is that we're very dependent on foreign capital today. If there were to be a tragedy, if there were to be a terrorist attack, in 9/11 we had a budget surplus. We were not nearly as dependent on foreign capital. Today we have budget deficit. The next decade we're going to have big budget deficits as a result of entitlements, and we're going to be far more dependent on foreign capital because our savings rate is so low. Right. And that might not be there, or if it's there, it might require very high risk premiums. So our lack of sound fiscal policy, which is going to be a big problem in the next decade, is going to constitute both a financial vulnerability and perhaps a national security vulnerability. Yeah. I think that's the short story of a long pitch for the book.
Well, thank you. And again, here's the book, if you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
Price of Liberty, Paying for America's Wars. And as the guy who, at least according to Google, is the first one to have nominated our current president as the worst president in United States history, I can appreciate the value of this financial argument.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And it goes through the revolution to today. So the reason I wrote it essentially was just to explain how, had they gone back in history and looked at the revolution, the Civil War, the Cold War, they could have done a far better job of mobilizing resources for the war in a responsible way, instead of sidestepping them with supplementals and not being candid with the American people about the cost of the war. Candor with the American people, even if it's candor about bad news, is a far better way of addressing wartime financing, or in my judgment, anything else, than sidestepping it and downplaying it. The great leaders have been very upfront and candid about what war costs, even though the amounts are very high and people don't particularly want to pay higher taxes. Many of them don't want to buy war bonds. Many of them didn't like the sacrifice of World War II, where they had wage and price controls and rationing. People didn't like that, but when their leaders told them it was important for the interests of the country, they went along. That if you don't lead by bold
well, I think a lot of people would make the argument that this war, I call it an attack,
right?
But this whatever you want to call it, was in many ways illicit. It was ill-conceived. It wasn't properly planned. It wasn't clear that the people needed this or wanted this.
Right.
And so you sidestep it. You sidestep their approval, essentially.
Exactly.
You take an early pass on the approval process before you do anything. You keep it off the books so that they can't actually reconcile what they're doing.
That's exactly
what it's costing
right.
them.
That's exactly
And you keep
right.
it off the news. You don't allow any bodies to be shown on television.
That's right.
It's a secret war almost.
And the tragedy is who sacrifices the troops. Troops don't get proper body armor. They don't get proper armaments for their Humvees. Their families back home, many of them have to go on welfare. And as we've seen, they don't get, in some cases, proper care after the war if they're wounded. And a lot of the Homeland Security things that we should have done, increase public health services, police, firemen, that's just not done. So we didn't establish the correct priorities. We didn't have a national dialogue. And we sidestepped tough issues. And you can't do that forever in a democracy. You need people who are educated about the issues. You need the American people to have a dialogue with them. And in past wars, they've done that. This war, they have
Well,
not.
again, in past wars, if you've got a Hitler out there and people should be talked to directly and said, there's a threat to our existence, you don't see it today, but you're going to see it tomorrow, that's a pretty straightforward conversation.
Exactly, and you should have that. And in the war on terrorism, you could have that, but even that has been obfuscated and blurred to the point where most Americans...
How do you have war with a bullet?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think it's a war.
And you need intelligence. You need to have a better education system so people abroad understand what we're trying to do. And basically, you need to have alliances. I mean, the interesting juxtaposition here is the alliance Bush put together for the first Gulf War, the first Bush and the first Gulf War. It had Muslim countries in it. It had other countries contributing because there was a genuine feeling of working together for a common good. This war, it's really a phony alliance. No one's given us any money. There are no Muslim countries.
Well,
in
they knew.
They knew it was a mistake. They knew it was a mistake, and they weren't willing to buy on.
Yeah.
And despite the fact, one of the most interesting Freudian elements of this book is Bush II was criticized. Well, this is not really a very good alliance. He says, well, it's a bigger alliance than we had in 1990, 1991. Yeah, bigger it may have been, but it gave no money, and it didn't really provide very much support. So in a way, he was trying to outdo his father by saying it was a bigger alliance, but it was certainly...
Well, his father and Scowcroft were both against.
Yes, and they understood if you don't have an alliance and you don't deal up front with the American people, you're not going to get much support. Yeah. Obviously, the war lost support because it was so badly blundered and bumbled, and mistakes were made, and people were being killed needlessly, unfortunately. But the lack of candor was one part of it, and trying to go in through the back door financially is never a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is so riddled with deceit.
Mistakes, misleading statements across the board.
Well, thank you for writing this. I hope it has a strong effect.
I hope you enjoy it, and I think it's interesting because it gives you a lot of the history of this. Brings it up to date.
We need to bring things back to normalcy somehow. Maybe this will help us
sooner or later,
with our checkbook at least.
Right.
Let's move on to an even more depressing question, maybe, or at least an interesting one. Condi Rice made a statement not long ago, and I use her. If you remember the movie Little Big Man, there was this phrase, the perfect reverse barometer.
Right.
So Condi said, and as you know, she spent her whole life at Stanford and Hoover studying the Cold War. That's
right.
her. So she said, there's no new Cold War on with Russia. And I thought, well, if she's saying it, it's just got to be wrong. What could be more embarrassing in her career than to have that begin as her legacy as the Secretary of State? Mm-hmm. Certainly, we know that Mr. Putin has instructed the radio stations to treat America as the enemy when they talk to their people in Russia. And so we've got a lot of things going on that not all Americans are aware of yet. And I'd like to start by looking at a brief history, if you'd do this for us. Take us very quickly from Soviet economics into where we are right now so that we can go forward from here.
Well, very briefly, at the end of what was called the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the end of, in effect, Russian domination of all the countries around it, which in most cases were independent before the Russians, in one way or another, took them over. And this was a takeover that was not a recent one. It occurred over a period of centuries. But essentially, Russia had this sort of nationalistic feeling of the great Russian people, but it also felt protected by adding a lot of satellite nations, not just after World War II, but as I say, for centuries before that. It gave Russia a protection. And Russia wanted this in part because of its earlier history being overridden by people from various parts of the world. The Turks, long time standing fight with the Turks and with the Chinese and with the Mongols and various others. So the Russians wanted to put themselves in a sort of an insulated position, which meant building up alliances and a network of countries all around them and integrating ultimately into the Soviet Union. Well, that fell apart in the early part of the 1990s. And what happened is the Russian economy deteriorated very dramatically after that. It lost a lot of its trading partners. There was a period of enormous disruption. Even when it moved to democracy, the party system was very fragmented. You had a president, but then you had a very disrupted party system with small parties and medium-sized parties all contesting with one another. And it was very hard for Yeltsin when he was president, not that he was the most competent guy in the world, but he couldn't really get any sort of alliances within the Duma, which is their equivalent of their House of Representatives. So the system itself deteriorated economically, and the best way of looking at it is to look at energy investment. If you look at energy, in one sense, the Russia is really a one-crop economy, and that's energy. Energy investment deteriorated very dramatically in the 1990s, just largely because they couldn't get their act together. They couldn't raise the capital. They couldn't organize themselves to put new investment in the energy area. On the other hand, what did happen, particularly after the currency was devalued after their financial crisis, is that a lot of non-energy related companies were stimulated. In fact, it became more expensive to import. So it encouraged a lot of domestic companies to make new investments in new kinds of capacity to fulfill domestic demand. And the other thing about Russia is they're very well-educated people by and large. The literacy rate in Russia is higher than that in the United States. So you get a lot of people who saw this as an entrepreneurial opportunity. And apart from the extractive goods industries, which are increasingly dominated now by the state, either directly or indirectly through the big state companies or state regulation of smaller companies, the companies that are in the non-extractive industry sector, in many cases, are doing quite well. They're attracting capital, lots of IPOs, lots of money is coming in to invest in new startup or mezzanine kind of companies, and therefore the economy is coming back. And the last point is your point that whether there's a Cold War, new Cold War or not, I don't think it's the same as the old Cold War, largely because the Red Army during the 60s, 70s, and 80s was a fairly formidable entity. It really isn't anymore, although it's building up. But now Russia wants to be an energy power, and because it supplies 30 or so of Russian oil, of Western European and Eastern European oil and gas, it can use its energy more influentially than perhaps other countries. And it's also trying to get energy alliances with the stands, with essentially Kazakhstan, but some of the other countries to the south that were part of the Soviet Union that produce a lot of energy. It wants to be sure that energy isn't going to the West. It wants to be sure that Russia has a lot of influence on where that energy goes. So it's not the same Cold War, but Russia's trying to establish its great power status primarily with energy now, and it's doing a reasonably good, although somewhat clumsy job from time to time.
Well, we'll come back to this, I think, in a couple of minutes, because that ending part where they took the money and put it back into the military, we'll do more of that in a minute.
Okay.
If we look at I think just for the sake of the group here, for those who aren't studying this stuff on a daily basis, let's also add some description of the extractive story. And I want to. You and I had dinner last night, so I'll just mention. I asked Bob about disclosure here and whether Goldman Sachs is involved in those businesses, and they are not. From what I've seen, it's a two-part story, which is a pretty ugly story, where the light bulb goes on in Mr. Putin's head one morning. He decides that he wants to nationalize all these industries, or effectively do so. And one by one, he takes every joint venture and crams down the shareholding of any non-Russian partner. He either kills or throws out or jails under false pretenses through kangaroo court activity, people like Khodorkovsky, who then get knifed in jail and so forth, and add 10 more years just before the guy's about to get out. And so all the oil holdings and the gas holdings and the other mineral things are not only state-controlled, but then you take places like Gazprom, which was a pretty well-run company. You remove the guy who's a master MBA guy who knows how to manage things, and you replace him with, we call them KGB, but they're really FSB now. The new name for KGB is FSB. So the state thugs who probably have very little training in oil investment and production and distribution. So what you've got is a bunch of these very important cash generators, all state-controlled or state-owned, and run by the secret police. Is that an accurate?
Well, they're some of them. They're certainly influenced by the Russian government on the whole energy sector. There are these two big state companies, Rosneft and Gazprom, and then there are private companies, primarily in the oil sector, and the government is in a couple of cases. Well, Yukos, the one you mentioned, where they broke it up and effectively
They invented a huge tax burden that didn't necessarily exist.
Huge tax burden. Well, a lot of them had tax burdens, but they weren't all collected.
Yeah.
This one they decided they would collect, and of course then they had to sell a lot of their assets, and who bought them? The major national oil company. But the issue with that is, first of all, that a lot of this money, if you look at the efficiency of state oil companies versus private oil companies, state oil companies in general around the world, Russia included, it's not as efficient in utilizing the money they make to plow into new technologies and to new energy development, because a lot of that money gets siphoned off for other national purposes, either funds or military or many other things.
The general ROI is discounted.
Yeah, right, exactly, because the money is used for social purposes or military purposes or political purposes, or there's what they call shrinkage, and that takes money away. So in general, they're not as efficient. Second, what has happened in Russia in particular, which is very troublesome for the future, is that they have been utilizing primarily the oil from what they call the legacy fields, brown fields as opposed to green fields. So what they've done is they've learned how to tap more of the oil in the brown fields, the old legacy fields, but they've put very little money into the new green fields investments. And those in the energy area are very capital intensive. First of all, they're in permafrost, which is much more complicated to drill in. They have some capability, but by and large, almost all the greenfield investments in Russia have required foreign technology and foreign companies, either directly or in partnership with Russian companies. So to keep their oil production up, and Russian oil production today is the second largest in the world next to Saudi Arabia. And in fact, for a few months last year, it was even higher than Saudi Arabia. But to keep those levels up and to enable them to grow, they're going to have to put a lot more capital into these greenfields investments, which are normally they're very capital intensive. The technology is much more complicated because they're in permafrost or they're offshore Siberia, and in areas that are very difficult. They're going to, if they try to do it themselves, it'll cost them a lot of money. Excuse me. If they try to get foreigners to do it, there's a problem because they're becoming, as you point out, somewhat more nationalistic about the development of their energy sector. And if they do have foreigners help them with this, they're going to be driving very tough deals to give the foreigners a relatively small share of the profits. They have to give them enough to get them in, but it's going to be a very tough negotiation.
Well, I don't know how they're going to do this in the future, which we should discuss at least briefly. But if you went up to today or this week, you've got a pretty clearly described history where they took money, investment money from a joint venture partner. They probably took expertise, Sakhalin 2 as an example, and learn all they can, take all they can, and then do the cram down afterwards. So it becomes a $20 billion project. It starts out as a 10, I think, goes to 20, and then they say,
change the terms.
I'll take controlling interest.
That's a big problem, and they're going to have a very difficult time getting.
Who's next? Who's going to do that deal again?
That is why a lot of the foreign companies are very antsy about doing this and plucking large amounts of money.
And Lord Brown's about to get a taste of the same.
Yes,
whip.
well, BP, but they've even done it with some of their own companies, their own private companies, where they squeeze them down for environmental and other reasons afterwards. And I think in the end, they have a very tough balancing act. On one hand, Putin wants to demonstrate that these can be developed with Russian companies for sort of nationalistic reasons. On the other hand, he desperately needs the foreign technology, the foreign know-how, at least for the time being, to tap all these new greenfields production sites that require the new technology. So he's going to have to do a delicate balancing act. They haven't gone full bore toward energy nationalism yet. They still have foreign companies in. Foreign companies are still coming in because there's so much oil there. But the other thing they're trying to do is make sure that they dominate or have a lot of influence over the oil production in places like Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. They don't want a lot of these pipelines going from them directly to the West.
Right.
They're trying to develop, and Putin took a tour through the stands a few weeks ago, and one of the reasons he did this was to make sure that the new pipelines, which are going to be built, deliver the oil into Russia, and then the oil can go from Russia to Western Europe, and also avoid the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. They don't want to have to rely on Turkey, so they're going to have it go out through places like Bulgaria and Greece.
Yeah.
So they're trying to make sure that they not only influence their oil, but influence the direction that other oil in the countries that border them, to keep, in effect, to minimize Western influence.
Well, one quick question. You say there are other foreign companies that are still coming in. I mean, BP's on its way out, I think, and Shell has already taken its licking. So who's coming in?
Eni, there are a few Italian companies that are coming in. There are a few other state companies that are coming in. There are still companies coming in, but not at a very rapid rate.
All right. And this kind of anticipates another question I had for you, which is, are we seeing the creation of a new, you can call it oligopoly if you wanted to, but there's the old cartel, which was Saudi and France. That's changing rapidly. Venezuela is becoming a very hostile and aggressive, active oil weapon kind of presence in the world, or a benefactor if you're on the good side of that stick. And using this thing as a political weapon or as an economic weapon, it was done a little more subtly in the past. Now it seems as though the kimono is open and this is what's going to happen. Chavez is obviously doing this on a daily basis. And I wonder, I think Putin's started to do this. He's done this with Europe a couple of times, Estonia just last week. Some poor guy pulled that statue down and moved him 100 yards, and that cut off all their energy for a few days. Yes. So I'm wondering if by this bad behavior, Russia falls into a new group of state-like thugs who are happy to use energy as a political weapon or as an economic weapon.
I think they will use it increasingly as an economic lever. I mean, the thing you mentioned with the tearing down of the statue was one. The more egregious one was there's this pipeline called the Druzhba pipeline, which Druzhba means friendship. The friendship pipeline goes through Belarus, and then from Belarus, the oil is delivered to various parts of Western Europe. Well, they cut that because Belarus put on a tax, so they cut it off. And of course, when they cut it off to Belarus, the oil stopped going to Western Europe. So that became a bit of a problem. They had to turn it back on. There were a lot of protests.
Yeah.
But clearly, they're trying to use it for to increase their political influence in the region. And they're also thinking of doing much the same. They're building this pipeline to the Soviet Far East, or the Russian Far East, which is going to go to Japan and China.
The Caspian.
Yeah, this is just oil from Siberia, from eastern Siberia, that's going to go across. And there's another one from Kazakhstan to China. So what they're trying to do there is to sort of broaden their energy influence to the Far East.
Yes.
They have some of it now because these Sakhalin projects are going to provide energy, but they're also going to provide oil from on these pipelines, and that is going to give them a lot more influence. On the other hand, if they overdo it, they could cause problems because they cause other countries to look for additional sources. And that gets to the Iran situation. One of the reasons a lot of the Western Europeans are looking to Iran as a big supplier is because they're so nervous about the Russian oil. So they're looking for a part of the world where there's a possibility of new production. And Iran's production has been going down, so they feel if they could sort of help Iran boost production, they get some of that. So the Europeans are really in a pinch. Soviet leverage on one side, and then the pressure to go to the Middle East on the other. And then some of these countries are not the most savory trading partners.
And we know that China's been buying a lot of forward contracts in Saudi.
Yeah.
Are they doing the same thing with Russia?
There's not as much delivery as there. When the pipeline is developed, then they will do it. But they certainly want to buy more Russian oil, and in fact, and more Russian gas. And in fact, geographically, it's very easy if you can build these pipelines down from eastern Siberia and far eastern Russia down to China, or deliver it by boat even with liquefied natural gas. You can do that. But increasingly, they're going to rely. They want to diversify as much as they can in Russian oil.
Smart.
As part
they
of
got
it.
after Nigeria. But I think it's natural to assume that they will be taking a large new share of the flow of those pipelines.
For sure they will. But the Russians are clever. The Chinese said, we want the pipeline to go only to China.
Yeah.
Whereas the Russians said, wait a minute, then you have more leverage over us. So we're going to push it out to the ports in the Hudka in the Russian Far East, and then it can go to Japan or China, which gives us a little bit more flexibility.
Yeah. They've done this dance a couple times
before. The Russians, they can be heavy-handed, but they're not stupid. They're very clever, and they sort of understand this game. It's the new great game with Russia being an energy power as opposed to a military power. Right. And they'll learn how to use it with less clumsy characteristics.
Someone's made a mistake with this clock, I'm sure. Well, so I guess to wrap this up, if you were wanting to do business in Russia, is this a high-risk proposition now? Has the risk gone up?
I don't think it's a high-risk proposition in the non-extractive goods sector. The extractive goods sector, the government clearly wants to dominate the commanding heights, so to speak. But in many other sectors, there is an opportunity to make productive investments. Technology, Russians are very good at technology, physics, a lot of things that they are developing. The danger is that if the energy sector deteriorates badly, and I don't think it will because I think the Russians understand that they can't afford to allow that to occur. But if the energy sector deteriorates, it'll slow down the rate of growth of the economy. But the other thing they're doing is they used to have this fund called the Fund for Future Generations. They're taking some of that money, it's $250 to $300 billion, and they're starting to use it to develop infrastructure, to improve the welfare system, to improve housing. So what they're doing now is shifting the economy more toward the consumer. And I think if they do that over a period of time, you'll see a lot of demand for sort of middle-class items, for new technology, for new infrastructure. And I think that by and large is pretty good. I just steer away from the extractive goods sectors, but there are a lot of productive opportunities. The parts of the Russian economy are still very vigorous, and they're turning a lot of scientists and engineers and a lot of people who are remarkably entrepreneurial for a country that's been dominated by communism for most of the first part of the last century. There's a lot of latent entrepreneurialism which is sort of bubbling up, and many of them are doing very well. You've got to do a lot of due diligence, though, because, as I say, the shrinkage factor and the backdoor deals and, shall we say, a certain measure of corruption, you have to really, that you have to watch. So whatever due diligence you do here before you invest, triple it in Russia. And then you might still make a mistake, but at least you'll be a little bit better prepared.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Thanks.